have to have a wheelbarrow to bring in to have the CV because it's so full of wonderful accomplishments and things that he has done and is doing. Just to give you some example, he's had multiple RO1 awards from the National Institute of Mental Health, which are extremely difficult to get. And it's enabled him to do some groundbreaking research on neuroimaging, biological markers, and really integrating data from lots of different fields and understanding illnesses like depression and bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, and taking us to the point of having new leads on how to understand and treat these illnesses. And he'll share some of that information with us today. Dr. Langenecker was educated at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and then did graduate work at Marquette, did an internship at Long Island Jewish, and then he went to the University of Michigan as a postdoc, and after that was completed, he was a faculty member at the University of Michigan until 2012, when he moved to the University of Illinois to become the director of cognitive neuroscience. And today he's going to give a grand rounds presentation, which will end a little before 1, and then we're going to extend that and work for a couple more hours. And hopefully a number of you will be able to stay for that so that you can get a deeper knowledge of neuroimaging and related fields and what they're teaching us about the disorders that we see so many of in our clinical work. This evening, Dr. Langenecker will be talking at 6 o'clock at Second Presbyterian Church for the general public. So if you're seeing patients this afternoon, tell them about this. It'll be a great opportunity for them to learn about what neuroscience is teaching us about these illnesses and how we can use that to improve care. Tomorrow he'll be meeting with some faculty and residents. If residents are here who would like to meet with him at lunch, I'm going to need to get a sort of a head count so we can order lunch for you. It's a free lunch. It's a great deal. Sponsored by the National Network of Depression Centers. It won't be pizza, I guarantee you. It'll be something else. It won't be from Vincenzo's, but it'll be pretty good stuff. So how many residents can we count on for tomorrow, those that are here? Can you raise your hand so I can get an idea? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, we'll probably order 10 lunches or something, so we'll have enough in case some other ones that aren't here today can come to that luncheon. That'll be in the Depression Center, up on the 6th floor conference room in our outpatient clinics. So now it's time to get rolling, and we should give a Louisville welcome to Dr. Scott Langenecker.
Thanks so much. Now, the first and most important thing is how do I get the CME to go away? Looks like that's just a different slideshow, so here we go. Oh, that's number 2. Back to number 1. Here. But this is the second one. I want the first one. That's number 2. It was just open. I saw it. There's just number 2. I don't see number 1. Anybody have any idea where the first one is? Otherwise, we'll start with number 2. Number 2 is more interesting. Sorry, I'm a Mac guy, so I'm struggling here. Does anybody know where the first one was loaded? Right? It's not there.
Number one. Firefox. Okay, Firefox on the bottom, right there.
Aha, there we go.
Okay.
Different format. Okay, we're good. It's a sign of my age that I'm getting bad with technology. All right, so what I want to do to start out with is to sort of give you an overview of where I think neuroscience is really focusing in terms of mood disorders. Some of this is my work, and some of it is work of other people. But I want to give you a sprinkling, and this is sort of where I think NIMH is going. This is where I think the field is going, and I think we're actually on the verge of some pretty significant breakthroughs in mood disorders. And now that I've got my feet back beneath me, I'd like to thank you all for coming today. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited that University of Louisville has a depression center, and I'm glad that I can hopefully convey some information to you about neuroimaging and neuroscience and mood disorders. And I must say, when we started our depression center, we actually looked at the Depression Center website here as one of the best ones in the country to model ours after. So whoever was involved in that process, well done. So I start out with thanks first because I'm a Midwestern boy and that's what we're taught. So these are all the folks who have been involved in the work that I've done. I just get to promote the hard work that they've done and hopefully be a good mouthpiece for that work. So all the folks in the maroon color are the University of Illinois folks, and all the people in blue are the Michigan folks. Some of us actually, a couple of us actually transferred from Michigan to Illinois at the same time, so they end up being red. And what I want to do is to start by posing a question that I ask myself as often as I can, because I think it informs all the work that I do. What does 3 months of depression cost? It's a philosophical question. It's actually a monetary question. It's an interpersonal question. The answer is that most of us don't even know. But we know enough to know that the price is way too high. And what we learned from the STAR-D trial, which is the largest trial of depression treatment in the field, is we learned that we can get a lot of people well. By 9 months, we can get 70% of the people who walk through most primary and tertiary care clinics well. That's great. But the reality is, it's trial and error. So if you're a patient, if I'm a patient walking into a clinic for the first time and I say to you, I'd really like to get well as soon as I can. And I know you want me to get as well as soon as I can. But I understand, because I did the research and I read STAR-D, that you're going to use a trial and error approach to see whether or not I can get better. And to me, that is an indication of where we are as a field and how far we still need to go. So the good news is we can get a lot of people well. The bad news is we don't know how to get them well faster. And the reason why I come back to this question of 3 months of depression is we're actually talking about the difference between maybe another 8 weeks of depression or another 20 weeks of depression for up to 40% of the people who walk through our door. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is what organ is primarily responsible for depression? It's a trick question because you all know that it's not just the brain. But the brain is the primary organ that's actually involved in depression. Turns out as we've learned more about the disease, that the thyroid gland, the adrenals, even now with the microbiome, the gut is involved, and the peripheral nervous system is also involved in the genesis and maintenance of depression. So it's not just the brain. But I like to focus on that because when I go to see a cardiologist, and thankfully I haven't had to go see a cardiologist yet, but if I do, how do they actually manage my care? What's the first thing that they do when I walk into the office, right? They grab my blood pressure. Now, it turns out that blood pressure is not a terribly reliable measure. It's not a terribly good predictor of much of anything. But if you have elevated blood pressure, it puts you in a different risk group for cardiovascular disease, right? And what do we do with that? Well, we actually manage that, in this country at least, we manage that fairly aggressively. The same thing with cholesterol levels. We don't have those biomarkers for depression, but I assure you that they're there. We just don't know what they are yet. So that's the preamble. Oops, do that. Okay, so first thing I do is talk about sources of support. The two most important sources of support are off there to the right. Those are my daughters. They motivate me to work towards a better world where if they actually happen to develop depression, maybe I can actually tell them, well, we can do the 3-month rather than the 9-month deal to get you well. Those are the awards that I've been lucky enough to receive to do some of this work that I'll be talking about today. And I always try and make sure that I don't forget to thank two very important stakeholders in this process. So patients have a lot more money on the table than I do. They have a lot more to win and a lot more to lose. And I also make sure that we always forget to thank the taxpayers. These grants and the NIMH system is a marvelous, fabulous thing, and I would put to you probably one of the best things that our government does. But that doesn't mean we should take it for granted. We should be grateful for the folks who work hard to support me to come and talk to you and teach you, and also to do this important work. All right, so back to conflicts. Those are my three lovely ladies in the place where I'd rather be. That's actually Puerto Rico. The real conflicts that I'm supposed to report today, the ones that are monetary in nature. So I'm the board president for the Illinois chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I've been doing that for about a year and a half. I've been involved with AFSP for about 14 years, and that's what I do for my volunteer work because, there's just not enough work to do in academia. And the reason why I got involved with this organization is because early on, John Graydon said to me, he said, well, you do understand the stakes that we're playing for here in this particular research endeavor. And I said, no, not really. He said, well, why don't you come to this walk? And I came to the first AFSP walk, which actually was an Out of the Darkness walk, or Into the Light. It was actually before they got the fancier algorithms and names and titles. And one of the things that I learned early on is that in my life and in my training, I really didn't have an appreciation for the stakes that we were playing in this game, if we want to call it a game. If you go to a walk like that, it's a very somber experience. It's a supportive experience as well, but people are struggling with loss, and they're struggling with loss because we've not yet gotten to the point where we've gotten better treatments. Most of the folks that we actually have these illnesses don't even come in for treatment. And actually not most, but a good minority of those who do come in for treatment don't get an adequate dose for an adequate amount of time. And I know you've heard a lot about that, and that's probably stuff that Jess talks about all the time. So I've done some contract work for Easter Seals and Cog State. Those are companies that's not stuff I'm going to be talking about today. I do a lot of test development or test improvement. I am firmly in the camp of evidence-based medicine and evidence-based measurement, and I envision a day when we would actually, when we schedule a patient for a consult, we would send them a link They would get it in their email. They'd open it up. They'd go to a website. They'd complete a bunch of these computer tasks that allow us to get a better understanding of how the disease is affecting their brain. And that would actually inform, when they walk through the door, how we would actually approach them and which treatments we might actually be interested in delivering. I know that's kind of a revolutionary idea, but I don't think it's that far away. So the bottom line is I'm happy to share the tools that I've developed. I'm happy to try and work with you if you have other tools that you want to use. I'll be talking a little bit about treatment effects today. I'm not talking about any off-label treatments. And the 2 medications I'll be talking about today were provided by Forrest and Lilly, but they had no involvement in the design, interpretation, or analysis of the data. All right. So what are we going to talk about first? Well, the first section is really sort of talking about the geography of depression. And when I say geography of depression, I mean geography of brain regions and brain networks that are affected by the illness. One of the first and most important preambles I want to make is that most of the things I'm talking about are not specific to depression. I could probably give the same talk about schizophrenia. I could give the same talk about bipolar disorder. I might even be able to sneak in a few of these pieces and talk about anxiety. And the point there is that our nomenclature, our ICD or our DSM, has lots of shared symptoms and lots of comorbidity, right? So most people know that folks who have a diagnosis of schizophrenia have had a prior diagnosis of anxiety disorder and or depression and or substance use. Half of the folks who have a diagnosis of major depressive disorder have a diagnosis of either anxiety and or substance use disorder. 70% of those who have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder also have a lifetime history of substance use disorder. So the DSM is our attempt to parse things into categories, and that's for research purposes, for billing purposes. But at the end of the day, there's a shared brain disease that leads to these types of symptoms. And so don't take what I'm talking about today as, oh, depression's X and Y and Z. Depression is X and Y and Z, but that's not exclusive to other diseases. So we're going to talk a little bit about depression models. We're going to talk a little bit about the research domain criteria. So the research domain criteria has gotten lots of mixed press is probably the right way to say it. And I want to provide a framework for the research domain criteria, which is, some people say, is it DSM or RDoC? I want to replace that with the word and, because that's how I approach my work, is what framework actually best helps me design an experiment or design an empirical trial to help patients or to break through in our understanding of these illnesses. So talk a little bit about the opportunities and challenges of that. I want to talk to you about what I refer to as a multi-hit model in risk for depression. I want to instill in you a little bit of knowledge about something that keeps me awake at night, which is the fact that we have treated depression historically as a 12-week disorder, kind of like extended fever or sickness or something, when in fact for most people, 70%, depression is a recurrent lifetime disorder. So I want you to think in your mind of depression more like multiple sclerosis and less like an extended illness. And that changes the way that we treat folks. And those of you who treat patients know this. As you work with patients, there are good periods and down periods, and you try and get them stable and well during the good period or bad periods so that the good periods can be extended and more frequent. So we're going to talk about some RDoC dimensions. First, we're going to talk about fear to acute threat. This is sort of, in layman's terms, hypervigilance or awareness of threats in the environment that interferes with your ability to focus on the things that are otherwise important to you. We'll talk about cognitive systems, which is what I spend most of my time studying. So things like attention, things like inhibitory control or impulse control. We're going to talk about fancy term processing speed with interference resolution. That's basically multitasking. How do you actually resolve trying to focus on multiple cognitive or physical activities at the same time and do so in an efficient manner? Declarative memory. So this is sort of, when I walk into a grocery store and I had 7 things that I wanted to buy and I only remember 4 of them, that's declarative memory. And then we'll move on to talk about reward. So reward is a exciting, I wouldn't say new area in depression, but it is relatively newer. So anhedonia, which is sort of the opposite of reward in some respects, is a long-standing, we've known about anhedonia and melancholia for a very long time, since the time of the Greeks. We'll talk about that as a construct. We're also going to talk about this idea of resting state, and we're stuck with that term. But what is the brain's baseline state? And it turns out that the brain never rests. About 85% of the brain's functions go on without us even being aware of it. I think it's actually higher than that. So this idea that the brain has all these background functions that are going on is a window into efficiency and crosstalk between different networks that are doing different types of activities. And then I want to illustrate this idea that depression is a recurrent lifetime illness for many people, and distinguishing between what is the active state of illness, what are some of the trait features, and then how do a number of episodes actually affect the disease as it progresses. Much like MS, for some people, there is a progression, a neuroprogression to the disorder. All right. So what is depression? Well, if you had John Graydon here a couple weeks ago, and he uses the plural term, and he taught me that, and so I can't use the same exact definition as him. But I do want you to think about it as plural. And what I'll talk about tonight in the public lecture is how we've sort of gradually cleaved off different neurological illnesses that used to be considered depression and are now considered something else. So the examples you could use are MS, which we already talked about. We could talk about Wilson's disease. We could talk about Cushing's disease. And there's any number of other ones that we could talk about that used to be considered depression and are now actually the neurobiology of those illnesses is known. And so we're gradually cleaving off these different subtypes of depression, and then we call them something else. And then we conveniently forget that we've actually made progress. We've actually made progress. So that's actually good to know. But for a working definition today, I want you to think of depression as difficulty controlling your thoughts and emotions, and in particular, the perseveration of negative affect. And you can see already, based upon what I've told you already, that that's actually a limited definition, but it allows me to at least give you a framework for what we'll be talking about today. So in work with Mary Phillips and Wayne Drevitz, we sort of have built this model of emotion processing and regulation. And the black circles are what Mary and Wayne and Scott Rausch and Danny Pine came up with originally, and then we added the colored boxes later. So basically there's a stimulus, internal or external, doesn't matter. The first thing that you do as a human being that is designed to live and thrive is to determine whether or not that's going to eat you or not, whether or not it's dangerous to you, or whether or not maybe something you actually want to approach or might want to eat. And once that happens, that positive or negative appraisal, your brain automatically and beautifully and efficiently comes up with all sorts of different subroutines that might relate to that. So the easiest example is I'm walking down the hall and I see Jess and he smiles at me and I smile back. That's almost a completely natural process, and it's such an important part of the human condition. But what happens if this becomes off kilter? What happens if your proclivity for perceiving negative information is actually biased? So now I see Jess walking down the hall. He's not smiling, he's not frowning, he just has a neutral expression. But I, because I'm experiencing a depressive episode myself, misperceive that lack of affect as being negative. Jess is not happy to see me. And what happens then? I might look away. I might turn around and walk the other way. I might pull out my phone and pretend not to notice that I've seen him. All these sorts of avoidance behaviors naturally come up to the fore. And as this occurs over and over and over in social experiences, these pathways become strengthened and the repertoire of negative and avoidance behaviors becomes stronger. There may also be this sort of diminished capacity to sort of see the bright side or to see the things that might bring us joy, both in social interactions and in our work and so on. And as we see fewer and fewer things that we see as points of joyful or points of reward, our happy muscles, our happy approach behaviors become atrophied, and we don't become as good at those things. And the final point I want to make is that even if I know, I have this tendency to sort of see things a little bit darker than they are, and maybe I should not do that, maybe I have a diminished capacity to change that perception and to say, you know what, Jess has got this neutral expression, but I'm still going to say hi to him because he might be having a tough day or he might be distracted or whatever that may be, and I might be able to have a really nice conversation with him. And if I don't test those hypotheses, then I'm not going to know. And the other thing I want to show you in this particular slide is that in the absence of depression, human beings have this tendency to over-appraise for the positive. So if I see Jess walking down the hall and he's scowling or looks unhappy, I have this natural tendency to attribute his mood state to something other than me. So if I'm a depressed person, I might say, oh, Jess is not happy with me, or Jess doesn't want to see me. But if I'm not depressed, I might have a tendency to say, oh, he's having a rough day. Maybe I should try and cheer him up. And there's this natural tendency to approach and to appreciate things as being a little bit brighter than they actually are. And there's a really cool study that I'll bring up in tonight's talk, and you may have seen it, where they actually looked at Instagram photos of individuals who had a history of depression, were at risk for depression, or had no history of depression. And those of you who have used Instagram, when you take your photos, you can use different types of filters to the photos. Then they add different elements of color and light. And it turns out that most individuals will add more, they'll use a filter that adds more warm colors to their photos, right? So your oranges, your reds, your yellows, brightening up the pictures. Individuals who have a history of depression, have depression now, or even who may be at risk for depression, have a tendency to use more blues and grays and blacks and whites. And when I first saw this paper, I thought, oh, this is just some, computer scientist who's taken 5 billion data points, and, the effect size is so small, it's completely irrelevant to things in life. If you actually get a chance to look at that paper, and I'd be happy to share it with people, it really isn't that the depressed people are doing things terribly different. It's the people who are not depressed who are adding all of this enriched color to their images, and they're just sort of reimagining and reinterpreting their experience in a very vivid and rich way. And that's probably part of the reason why things like cognitive behavioral therapy and behavioral activation therapy are so effective in helping folks with depression, because you really get people to focus more on how to enrich and get more meaning out of their lives. So the point that I want to make here is that there are many roads to Rome. And if there are many roads to Rome, if there are many different neural systems that can be negatively affected that lead us to this diagnosis that we call depression, why in the world would we expect to have one common biomarker? We shouldn't. Absolutely shouldn't. So one of the lessons that the field has learned, and painfully, is the experience of the dexamethasone suppression test, right? So this is a test that came out before my time, but there's about 40% of individuals with depression who fail to suppress with dexamethasone. And I see that as being incredibly informative and exciting. But the field at the time said, well, shoot, it's not 100%, we failed. But that's what we found with Cushing's disease too. There's only, probably 8 to 10% at most of people who come into a particular clinic who might be at risk for Cushing's disease, who experience anxiety and depression. And the actual number is much lower than that. But the point being is that we have to stop thinking about it as a one-size-fits-all type of model. There are many different pathways by which people can become depressed, which means there's many different pathways by which people can reattain wellness. So this is a re-illustration of the RDoC matrix that we put together. This is something that I did with Mary Phillips. And the reason why we put the RDoC matrix into this particular format is we wanted people to really think about these neural systems and these traits and cognitive and affective attributes as actually being part of a whole and actually working with and integrating each other. So there's a cognitive domain with a number of different subdomains in it. There's sort of a positive valence, which gets back to the positive valence that I was talking about in the model. There's a negative valence. There's actually a social domain. And then there's an arousal and regulatory domain. And I don't have a ton of time to talk about it today, but the information that's coming out of circadian studies of circadian rhythm, blue light therapy, amber light, diminishing amber light later in the day, exercise physiology, circadian modulation. These things are actually potentially groundbreaking in how we understand and treat the disorder. And then you can break down with any given domain, you can go down to lower and lower and lower levels of granularity. And the cool thing about that is that if you go down further into these levels of construct to subconstruct to microconstruct, we don't yet know what level of granularity is actually the most meaningful. So the best way to think about that is if you do an assay of something and you're doing it in parts per million, right? And it actually turns out that you need to be in parts per billion to actually get a good level of granularity to get a good bioassay. If you're doing it in parts per million, you're going to completely miss the entire biomarker. We don't know the level of precision that we actually need to measure. And so it's a daunting challenge to think of the fact that any given patient who walks through our door may have different pathways to their illness, and that the tools that we're using to measure the illness are not at the level of precision that we need. And we might be too fine level of precision, we might be zooming in too close, we might be zooming out too far. We don't actually know. So the reason why I get excited about this, trained as a psychologist and steeped in the Minnesota Multiple Personality Index, MMPI, you can actually think about RDoC and building a profile. And this particular profile, you can see the person has some difficulties in the cognitive domain. They actually have some elevations in the positive valence domain and some difficulties in the negative valence and circadian domains. This is what I envision as somebody who's a little bit hypomanic, right? So you might actually be able to get a greater level of precision in subtyping mood disorders or anxiety disorders or comorbid disorders by using profiles of this type. Now, I imagine that something like this is potentially going to take, in an optimal situation to actually figure out the final frontier, which we refer to as the brain. This is not easy work, and it's not going to be fast. But the point is that we can actually make progress. We can actually make steady progress by doing a couple simple things, and I'll talk about those in a bit. The other thing that RDoC has allowed us to do is to address this Tower of Babel issue. So in academia, we are schooled, I think is the right term, to come up with our own ideas, to be innovative, to be creative, to have a breakthrough, to put our name on something. And the tendency that leads to is to take something that we already kind of know is there and to add a little bit to it and then give it a different name. And we continue to do this. And what ends up happening is people at different centers with different backgrounds talk about the same basic constructs using slightly different terminology. So RDoC is a way to sort of get us on the common page and common terminology. So I've already touched upon some of these, but I want to highlight a couple more. So it allows us to address the idea of comorbidity a little bit better. It allows us to talk across multiple, what we refer to as silos, again, a John Graydon term. It allows us to actually think about assessment tools in a different sort of way, right? So we don't have to think about, oh, do they have 5 of 9 symptoms on the DSM? Maybe their score on a dimensional measure is medium for depression and high for anxiety and low for mania, and that tells us something about how to treat them that's different than what we thought before. And then there's some different data-driven processes that are substantially strengthened by this particular approach. There are also some challenges. And one of the largest challenges is that, not everybody was totally thrilled with DSM and ICD 9 and 10, and now we're trying to throw in a whole different subset of nomenclature and terminology, and it requires a pretty significant learning curve. And what people ask me all the time is, well, how does this apply to what I'm going to do in the clinic with the patient? Well, I would put to you that it does apply to what we can do with the patient in the clinic, and I hope to show you that in a little bit. The other thing is that people have been using what I referred to before, this idea that you have to be pro-RDoC or pro-DSM. Well, I'm pro-science, and if I'm pro-science, I'm going to use whatever framework and whatever tools are available to me to ask and answer good questions. And sometimes the answers that I get aren't the ones that support either DSM or RDoC, and that's fine. I'm not here to tell you how to do science. I'm here to tell you that these are just frameworks to help us to understand these illnesses. The unfortunate thing that's come out of this is that in recent years we've had this drummed into our head that research has to be theoretical, it has to be hypothesis driven, and if you don't have a good hypothesis, you are not going to get funded. What this has allowed us to do is to say, well, you know what? We've done lots of hypothesis-driven research. The biggest breakthroughs in depression treatment have come through what? Serendipity, right? Neurologists and psychiatrists who've done a good job of observing epilepsy patients observed that those who were on mood stabilizers had improvement in their depression symptoms. The advent of the SSRIs followed after that. Serendipity. Is it really serendipity? No. It's controlled experiments and careful observation. That's how we busted the plague, and it's exactly how we're probably going to make most of our breakthroughs. So you create a clinical research infrastructure or a experimental research infrastructure where you have careful control over what you're studying, why you're studying it, and 9 times out of 10 you're going to find something that you didn't expect, but at least you'll actually learn something about the disease that you didn't know before. All right. So I put these slides in here so I take a deep breath and so you guys don't get tired of me talking really fast. And I get to have some coffee. All right, so let's talk about this lifespan model. So this has come from frustration on my part about how I approached the illness when I first started. So when I first started, I said, I'm going to study adults. And so adults means you're not going to study kids and you're not going to study older adults. So what does that mean? Well, I'm going to study people between 18 and 65, right? Working age by definition of most of our criteria in the society. And what did I learn early on? Well, I learned that people who have depression who are 55 are very different than people who have depression who are 18. And the reality is that we would have samples where 70% of the people were between 18 and 30, and 30% of the sample were people between the ages of 30 and 65, and none of our measurements work the same in those groups. To top it off, as you all well know, as we get older, we have more capacity, more experiences. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. But most comorbid illnesses, especially most comorbid medical illnesses with depression, emerge in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So now I've got a group of 30 to 65-year-olds in my data that are much messier and have many more comorbidities than my 18 to 30-year-olds. What does that do? It adds noise to my measurement. So then I got super clever and said, well, why don't we just measure people who are 18 to 25 and not worry about those folks who are older? And so I did. And what I missed in that process is the ability to understand disease progression. And so now I've been trying to write grants to say, well, why don't we take people who are in their 20s, their 30s, and their 40s and follow each of them for a couple of years and build this tapestry of how does the disease actually progress over time. And it's kind of embarrassing. And the reason why it's embarrassing is because with MS, it took them about 8 years to get to the point where they said, there's different courses of this illness, and we should probably get a trajectory of how it affects different people over time. So between like 1985 and 1993 or 1994, the terminology for different courses of MS emerged, right? Do we have that terminology in depression? I would argue some people do. Some people use that terminology, but a lot of us don't. And I think it's really important that we start thinking about depression as a lifespan illness. The other thing that's critical, and this graph illustrates it, is that depression is also a neurodevelopmental disorder. The substrates of risk for depression emerge in adolescence and maybe even earlier. And so we've been thinking about depression as primarily a disorder of adulthood, or I have. And I've relearned or learned for the first time that these kids are different in middle school. They're different in grade school. They're different in adolescence. In the process of doing that, I've also learned something that most of us forget, is that most of the people who are at risk, most of the people who exhibit these risk factors for depression do not ever develop a depressive episode. The rule is actually resilience. So if I take a high-risk sample and define a high-risk sample by somebody who has both a mother and a father with a history of depression, their risk for depression themselves, the child, is increased about threefold, right? So I go from about 12 to 16% lifetime prevalence to about 30 to 40% lifetime prevalence. That still means 60% of kids who have parents, both parents, who have a depressive illness do not develop the illness. So resilience is actually the key here. And those people, of course, don't walk into our clinics. We don't see them. But those are the folks who are some of the best advocates for this illness. And so we sort of developed this framework for understanding depression. There's a risk phase, and we think of risk, we think of vulnerability, we think of traits, we also think of environmental factors. And then there's some acute effects of illness. So what are some of the things that the illness, just like a fever, suppresses or disrupts? And then there's this idea of scar, which is the fact that once you've experienced a depressive episode, your brain changes. There are changes that are a risk for depression, and then there are also changes that are occurring during the episode itself. And so you may not go back to your normal level of functioning. One of the interns I worked with last year, we sort of did this mental exercise, and he said, well, what if depression is something like a mild TBI? What would that mean? What would it mean if you said having a depressive episode means you actually have this mild TBI, and there's an illness phase, and then there's a recovery phase? And maybe, which some of the literature has shown, that when you treat depression, hopefulness improves in, say, 2-3 weeks. And some of the symptoms start to remit by 4 to 8 weeks. But what does the longitudinal data show? The longitudinal data shows that by 6 months, people are still having difficulty functioning at work, functioning in their home. maybe even up to a year. They might continue to have cognitive problems. And so maybe this idea of depression as a neurocognitive illness and having a different recovery period than symptoms actually tells us something about the disease and how we actually can treat it better. And then as people have more episodes of depression over time, maybe there's accumulation of these neural system scars over time. So back to our profile. We're going to go through a couple of different domains to illustrate the ways to measure, or one of the ways to measure that particular domain, and then perhaps a little bit on some of the brain systems that are involved. So we'll start with acute, active or acute threat in the red bar there. And one of the nice things about RDoC is it expands our mental framework for understanding how we can understand illness. So because we've been frustrated by biomarkers and because we've been frustrated by brain markers, we have gone back to rely on self-report. And self-report is great because self-report is a window into the difficulties and suffering that patients are experiencing. But self-report has only gotten us so far. So measures of self-report don't tell us a lot about how the disease is going to progress. They don't tell us a lot about whether or not somebody is going to be at risk for recurrence of illness once they get well. They don't tell us a lot about whether or not somebody's actually going to get well with any particular given treatment. So they're a marker of things are not going well, but they're not a marker of how we get people better. And so what RDoC is allowing us to do is to add additional pieces of information that may help us inform not just about illness, but also about how people get well. And that's going to be the second part of my talk today. So this is just a brief illustration of the different ways of filling in the matrix. So we have some self-report scales that people can fill out that tell us about fear, anxiety, hypervigilance. We have some instruments that are filled out by the clinician that measure the same sorts of things. We have some performance measures that are attempting to get objective markers that align with those symptom reports. And then we have some neuroimaging biomarkers. You could also add, say, EEG in there as well. And the idea in RDoC is that it's sort of along two dimensions. So the lateral dimension is how do these pieces fit together? Is there a latent factor of fear to acute threat or hypervigilance or something of that nature? And then the vertical is actually what interests me more, which is there a subtype of depression or depression and anxiety where hypervigilance is a key component of the illness? And that particular key component of the illness is something that we can actually work on specific targeted therapies for. And we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. So this is a task that we designed based upon work that Ruben Gur at Penn put together. It's a simple explicit face identification task. It's actually pretty easy to do. The trick is that most facial expressions are brief in nature. So the average length of time that a smile is on a given person's face is about 120 milliseconds. Fear is even shorter duration than that. But it turns out if you make a task that has these very brief, rapid durations of emotions on them, if somebody blinks or they look away, they'll miss it. So we have a little bit longer duration of the task, and we wanted it to be ecologically valid. So if people have difficulty explicitly denoting emotions in other individuals, you can imagine that that's going to have a direct ramifications for how they interact with those people. And so we focus on 4 of the 8 key emotions. In this case, we're talking more about the negative emotions. And this is just an illustration of the task. The other thing that you have to do with a task like this is you have to mask it. So you put a mixed up face after the original face. and that way there's no what's referred to as retinal afterburn that can enable the person to sort of extend the amount of time that they can perceive the image. So this is one of the first studies we did, and this addresses that question of age. So we had young, we had old, we had men, we had women, we had depressed, we had not. And you can sort of build this model of what is the percentage of people with depression who are going to have this particular difficulty. And I want you to focus on the green bars there. The green bars are the people who have normal emotion processing functioning. So even though depressed folks tend to have more difficulty, even though individuals with bipolar disorder tend to have more difficulty, the vast majority of those folks do not have difficulty in emotion processing. I emphasize that because when we talk to patients and we say, oh yeah, we'll do these quick tests to see how your brain's functioning and see if we can help you function better, they say, oh, my brain is broken. And I have to bring it back to the point where we're looking at levels of precision here. So if only 30% of those with bipolar disorder are having this particular difficulty, that means there's some other process that's interfering with their functioning that's leading to bipolar illness, but it's not this one. And that means that if we have eventually treatments that target these particular weaknesses, it's only going to be relevant for 30% of the people with the illness. So this is a more recent study. This is a preliminary data chunk. So we have all those particular measures, and we're putting them into a factor analysis. This is just the Hamilton Anxiety Score, and you can see that the distribution of the score, as it's intended, is very different in the patient group. So AMD is any mood disorder, and healthy controls have a different distribution of the symptoms. But then if you look at the vulnerability facet from this is openness, you can see there's actually a nice distribution in both groups. And so we take all of these different behavioral, performance, self-report, other report, and neuroimaging markers, and we put them into this big latent factor analysis and say, is there one latent factor that might sort of address this concept of negative valence? And the answer is, so just to give you a feel for the regions that are relevant, when you're perceiving negative emotions, the amygdala obviously is relevant for any emotional perception, but tends to be a little bit more salient in negative mood disorders for negative stimuli. Also, the insula, anterior insula, and a little bit of posterior insula is relevant as well. So those are elevated, which is a marker potentially of illness. And then this is just the correlation matrix. And what I've done is I've sort of highlighted them in color so that you could see that the correlation matrix is sort of a prelude to the fact that the factor analysis is not going to work out terribly well. All the significant correlations should be yellow, and there should be a lot more yellow there than there is. Notably, the self-report measures kind of cluster up here in the upper left-hand corner, and the brain measures sort of cluster in the bottom right-hand corner, and they're kind of doing their own thing. So if you put them into this factor analysis, you get 4 factors. So the first factor is all the brain regions. Okay, that's great. The second factor is anxiety personality measures. That's fine. Then there's anxiety symptom measures. And finally, you get to a factor that integrates brain measurements and anxiety measures. And gosh, I was hoping it would be the trait markers of anxiety. But no, it's the acute symptom measurements of anxiety that align with these brain measures of anxiety too. So it's a humbling experience, and I think it'll continue to be a humbling experience. But it is an illustration of how we can do this. So that there's a coqui frog, if you've ever been to Puerto Rico. They make beautiful sounds. They're really hard to find, though. So let's move on to cognitive control. Let me do a time check here. All right, I get 20 minutes. Is that right? Okay, good. So cognitive control is something that I spend most of my time studying. We're only going to cover it briefly here. So this is a large study that we published a couple years back looking at depression, bipolar disorder, sustained attention, And this is sort of the same basic point that I was making before. Let me introduce you to the task. So each of those screens up there, each of those squares is a 500 millisecond screen that shows up on the computer screen. A series of letters. Most of the letters are distractors. The individual is asked to respond every time they see an X, a Y, or a Z. And we're just looking to see how accurate people can be. You can see here in the middle, there's sort of an indication of the normative levels. So our normative cutoffs are 5%, 9%, and 16% for different cutoffs based upon standard deviations. And you can see that depressed and bipolar people who experience depression and bipolar illness have about a doubling of the incidence of impairment relative to the control group for response time. For accuracy, it's a little bit more so for bipolar disorder than it is for major depressive disorder. But again, I come back to this point that most individuals who have these illnesses do not exhibit this particular cognitive weakness. Now, it turns out that there are some people who have difficulty in multiple domains of functioning, but some have difficulties only in one domain of functioning. And that information may potentially lead us to different treatment strategies. So this is just the brain imaging data. To walk it back a little bit, on the left-hand side, these are the brain regions that are important for sustained attention in all the individuals. This is about a subset of about 60 in total. And what we're measuring here is changes in blood flow, capitalizing on the fact that blood that has hemoglobin with oxygen attached to it has different magnetic properties than blood with hemoglobin that doesn't have oxygen attached to it. People use the terms diamagnetic and paramagnetic. We can capitalize on that in the fMRI scanner to actually get an index of how much oxygenation is occurring in a given brain region in a given slice of time. So every 2 seconds we get a different measurement. And here you can just see the brain regions that are involved, and then the brain regions that are actually more involved in individuals who have a history and current episode of depression or bipolar depression. This is just another illustration of the same thing, different views. So the basic point I want to make here, and I'm sort of going to continue to be redundant, is that not every person who has experiences these illnesses has these particular cognitive or affective difficulties. We're just sort of going through the domains. All right, so let's move on. I think I want to skip over memory, and I want to go to reward. There it is. Maybe. So that's my daughter with her hand-built iguana. All right, so let's talk about reward. So reward is a new area of study in depression, and I'm not going to talk about inflammation at all today, but I do want to briefly highlight the fact that back when we thought MS was the same thing as depression, that was a specific type of neuroinflammation that led to very specific white matter lesions in the cortex. There are other much less significant types of inflammation, and we learned a lot of this through some of our cancer treatments that incidentally increase levels of depression symptoms. That inflammation, even low-level inflammation, is an important factor in depression for a subset of people. And it turns out the people who are more anhedonic, more lower on energy, more sort of illustrating what we refer to as sickness syndrome, may have sort of sub-threshold levels of inflammation that if you treat them with simple things, and I'm not a physician, I'm not telling you to do this, I'm telling you to look at the literature. If you treat them with anti-inflammatory agents, you might actually get some improvement in depression symptoms. All right, so we're going to talk about anhedonia, this idea that you can have decreased capacity to enjoy or experience pleasurable activities. And here we're going to talk about reward. So we're going to talk about pursuit of these particular levels of activity. And one of the scales that we've used, and I've been surprised at how sensitive and how simple it is the Behavioral Activation and Inhibition Scale, so the BISBAS. And the behavioral activation is broken down into 3 different components. So there's this reward sensitivity, this idea that I experience something and I enjoy it. There's the idea of drive, where I'll go after things that I want. And then there's this sort of novelty/fun seeking. And we're more interested in the reward sensitivity and drive components because we think that they are directly affected by anhedonia. So the monetary incentive delay task is one that's been around for about 2 decades, and we sort of took it and we tried to improve it. In the process, we actually completely destroyed our experiment, and we learned something really, really cool. So this is that serendipity point I was making before. So we knew that there were processing speed differences. Folks with depression tend to be a little bit slower in their processing speed. And this is a very simple processing speed task. So what it's designed to do, it's designed to give you a clue. If the red circle comes up, you've got an opportunity to win. If a blue square comes up, you have an opportunity to avoid losing money. And a green triangle means that nothing's going to happen. And then you have this cross that comes up, and then you have this white box. And the white box is really only up there for a very brief period of time, maybe 220 milliseconds, give or take a little bit, depending upon who does the experiment. So very rapid response time. And of course, folks who have psychomotor slowing might be those who are experiencing depression. So we said, well, why don't we make sure that that white box is up there in an individually titrated fashion so that everybody has a fair chance of getting the correct ratio of reward. And it was supposed to be about 66% of the time. And so what we did is we tried to hit that window between 50 and 80%. If they were below 50% in accuracy, we slowed down the amount of time that the white box was on the screen. And if they are above 80%, we actually made it faster. We made the task harder. And we did this in stages. So we had a practice before they went into the scanner. We did an adjustment there. We did an adjustment after the first run and the second run, and then runs 3 and 4 were the ones that we thought would be the test run. And this just illustrates those particular differences. So I can have, if I'm at 60%, there's going to be no change. But let's say I'm actually not doing that well. I'm only getting 34% correct. We actually made it slower by a half standard deviation. If I'm still not doing well, we make it slower again by another half standard deviation. And of course, if you're doing really well, we make it harder. So this should equal out differences, right? Well, no, it doesn't. What ends up happening is in practice, the 2 different groups were actually pretty close. And as we made the task easier, the healthy individuals took advantage of those manipulations and made a lot of money. Individuals who had active depression did not take advantage of those opportunities and did not make a lot of money. They actually lost a little bit of money. And if you see how this evolves, so this is practice. You can see both groups are making a little bit of money. Then we put them in the scanner. Put them in the scanner, it's actually kind of a distracting environment. It makes it a little bit harder. But you can see that the control group's kind of holding their own, and the depressed group there in blue is losing a little bit of money. We make an adjustment here, right? So after this particular run, we make an adjustment. We make it easier if you're struggling. We make it harder if you're doing well. What happens? The control group takes advantage of this opportunity and says, I can do this. The depressed group is not taking advantage of that opportunity. And as we move into the final phases of the study, you can see that the control group is continuing to take advantage of the opportunity to make money, and the depressed group is failing to take advantage of that opportunity. Even though we've specifically, in a very individualized manner, made the task easier. This was not supposed to be a behavioral performance marker. This was supposed to be, we're going to have everybody get the same level of success, and we're going to see whether or not their response in the nucleus accumbens is different. Failed miserably at equilibrating the task difficulty. But we did succeed in understanding a lot about depression we didn't know before. Because it turns out that this behavioral activation reward responsiveness is a great predictor of who's going to be more likely to lose money in that bottom left-hand quadrant of that scatter plot there. And it just turned out we were running another study at the same time in remitted folks, and we thought, well, it would be really nice if this was independent of symptoms and we could find this trait marker that related to inability to take advantage of opportunities for reward. And it turns out that that's not true. When you put people who are not actively depressed into this particular paradigm, you can see that blue line and that green line are completely overlapping. Both of those groups take complete advantage of the opportunity to make money. Moreover, the behavioral activation correlation completely goes away. But notice that I kept the scale exactly the same. And I kept it exactly the same because you can see that bottom left-hand quadrant. There's nobody in that bottom left-hand quadrant. So now we have a conundrum. Is it the case that people who are actively depressed are temporarily in that lower left-hand quadrant of lower reward responsiveness? Or is it the case that we recruited two different subsets of people and that those who are in that lower left-hand quadrant of reward responsiveness don't get to the point of remission and have sustained illness, and that's sort of a feature of it? So right now we're actually doing a sequential set of tests of remitted people, and we're trying to look and see whether symptom fluctuations over the course of illness relate to changes in this behavioral activation scale. And why does that matter? Well, it turns out that if you could imagine, like I alluded to at the beginning of my talk, that you send a patient a link 2 weeks before they come in for their appointment, and they do these computerized tasks online in their own home at their own pace, and you get that information, you say, oh, this particular patient's having trouble with reward, they're fine in cognitive control, and they're not having any trouble in emotion processing. You already then can start to do some hypothesis testing in your mind about what am I going to ask them when they walk through the door? What particular treatments might I be most interested in trying with them? And if you were doing experimental clinical trials, you might say, well, if people have reward difficulties, I'm going to go to a dopamine agent or a norepinephrine agent. I'm not going to go to a serotonin agent. If somebody has more hypervigilance or impulsivity issues, I'm going to go to a serotonin agent. And you can actually design clinical trials in your clinical practice without lots of fancy tools that your patients actually will really respond to. And so I'm not going to have time to talk about it in this part, but I'll talk about it in the next part. We actually did this in our clinic. We didn't have a link to send them, but we actually tested them the first day that they walked in. And this is just an overlay of the particular slides. All right, so I got ahead of myself. Let me wrap up here. I always put more things in than I have time for because I don't know how fast I'm going to talk. All right. I think all I had was a conclusion slide, so let me move back. Let me move back here. We'll just stop here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yeah. That's the most beautiful question. And the reason why it's a beautiful question, I didn't pay her to ask that question. We had 100% compliance in the University of Michigan. We had a small army of interns and undergraduates. We tested young, we tested old, we tested pregnant women, we tested people who had physical disabilities. We had 0 refusals. And it's a simple thing. You tell people depression's a brain disorder and you want to get a better assay of how their brain's functioning. They say, great, sign me up. Now, maybe it's a selection factor. People who are interested in coming to the University of Michigan are interested in getting the Cadillac of service, because that's how we described it. The other thing about this is we actually had automated scoring we only had 2 of the tasks that we gave people. We had automated scoring, so the test results were done in 5 minutes. You could show them to the patient. Patient could actually walk into the resident or doc's office and see the results. I can't say whether or not it changed the way treatment was administered, but I will show you in the second half of the talk today that we actually can predict who's going to respond to standard treatment with these measures, kind of like what you'd expect. Other questions? Yeah. Why do we have mood in the first place? So if you take Randy Nessie's perspective, which I've become more and more inclined to think of, is that there's a Darwinian purpose to mood, and there's actually potentially a Darwinian purpose to depression. So if I am sick or wounded or ill, it might be a good idea for me to stay at home, to stay in a safe place, to not move out into the environment, to not interact with people, and that might allow me to get better and survive, right? Yes. Right. I'm not sure if I understand. Do we need more information? Is that your question? We don't need any of this information. So if I have a person who's experiencing, and this is the point I started with, if I have a person who's experiencing depression, I can go through the STAR-D sequence of different treatments, and by 9 months, that person, 7 out of 10 are going to be well, right? But what happens if it turns out that I can jump to the second treatment because I know that a standard SSRI is not going to help somebody who has reward processing problems? I can go right to the second level of treatment, and I can save that patient 12 weeks of underperformance at work, or relationship dysfunction, or suicidal ideation. I think if we can do that, that can be a game changer. And I think there's a real value to that. But you're absolutely right. We don't need to change the way we approach treatment. We can continue to do trial and error treatment. And I would say that good clinicians don't actually do trial and error treatment. They develop their own mental rubrics for assessing different subtypes of depression and which treatments actually work. And some of us who do research, we try and listen very carefully to really good clinicians who are getting response rates in 4 months of 60 and 70%. And we try and understand what are they capturing, and then how do we actually transfer that knowledge, that wisdom, into experimental designs or into our training programs, so that it doesn't take 10 years for somebody to get to that expert level of precision. And it happens in psychiatry, it happens in psychology. 10 years of experience, you get a much better chance of responding if your provider has that level of experience than if they don't. So there's something that good clinicians are doing that we need to be able to convey and teach at a much more rapid rate. And these biomarkers and measures may allow us to get better understanding of what that mental rubric that good clinicians use is. It gives us a better purchase for it, and it gives us the potential to teach it more easily, in theory. Yes?
Your first figures, the models would be very synchronous with the way cognitive behavior therapists want to see things. It's stimulus, and then there perhaps biases or differences in the way the mind processes things, negative and positive valences. Taking that forward, we work with RDocs and imaging. Any leads yet on profiles from RDocs or other studies that might predict which patients might be better suited to get cognitive behavior as part of their treatment?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that question. So Luan Fan, Heidi Klump, and myself have an RDoC grant, and the grant is actually randomization to SSRI, any SSRI or CBT. And it turns out that reward processing, those people who have difficulty with reward processing respond better to CBT. And those people who have more hypervigilance and negative valence respond better to medication. It also turns out that those people who are more impulsive respond better to medication. And we think that it's the behavioral activation component that specifically is addressing the reward problem in CBT. We don't know that. We haven't done the mechanistic breakdown, but that's what we suspect. The other thing that I really like about this particular model, and I used to have a much more primitive view of this, is I thought, medications are on the left and psychotherapies are on the right. So psychotherapy is all about regulation of the things that are happening to you, and medication is all about the earlier levels of more primitive processing. It turns out that medication actually affects regulation too, and psychotherapy actually does affect some of these approach and avoidance behaviors, right? So if you teach people to test the environment, to test the hypothesis that somebody is rejecting them, and that hypothesis is disconfirmed, then you're actually changing these earlier pathways, right? Not everything has to go to negative right away. Sometimes you're actually getting people to pause a little bit in that appraisal and collect more information before they actually jump to conclusions and move right to the avoidance behavior. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Just an editorial for students and residents. Right now, in clinical practice, we have a bit of this tower of Babel phenomenon. If you happen to be a cognitive behavior therapist, maybe you're not a physician, you don't prescribe medicine, you would like to choose that. If you're a physician who only has 20 minutes, 15 minutes with the patient, you might be more likely to choose a drug or send them to CMS or whatever. And then there's also the comprehensive approach. You don't have specificity, so it's already. And I think the research data shows that combined CBT and medication gives you a bit of an edge, not a huge edge, but some edge, particularly for severe depression.
Right.
So maybe the tower of Babel or comprehensive, I think where we need to go is some stuff is figuring out early on for which patient what's the best approach.
Yeah, and they do this. They do this in cancer now. They run your genetic panel, and they know whether you're going to respond to a different type of chemotherapy. It's an unfair analogy because cancer gets about 100,000% more funding than we do. It's not even on scale. I'll talk a little bit about that tonight about how part of the illness is this failed advocacy. So cancer patients aren't afraid to advocate, but patients who have psychiatric illnesses are afraid to advocate. There's still a fair amount of stigma there. Other questions? All right, I think we're going to break.